unfortunately has been called to a meeting in South Africa. So he wasn't able to join us from the beginning. Hopefully he will be able to connect with us after his arrival in South Africa. So this discussion takes place with the election pending in less than 2 weeks. And the title, as you've all seen, is Elections 2023. What are the prospects of meeting regional and continental best practices? Now, this particular policy dialogue is a wrap-up of the dialogue series that's been running since August 2022 and before August 2022. And the series was in the way of an audit of the pre-election process, all the things that we expected to be present and in place when these elections took place. And they were covered and framed very nicely at the beginning of the series under 5 main themes by Dr. Philan Zamchia. The themes were very simply information, inclusion, insulation, integrity, and irreversibility. And the idea of the themes were each of them picked on a particular theme that brought in multiple aspects of the elections. So, for example, irreversibility spoke not only to the notion that the election was sufficiently in line with best practice, that the losers would happily accept the result, but also dealt with, for example, any dispute that happens and the behavior of the courts. Each of these things covered all the range of issues in the election: voters' roll, delimitation, the election commission, whether people were participating freely and openly. And the inputs for this webinar, these series of webinars, came from a wide range of people, from national experts, from regional experts, and from international experts. And all of these were captured, so they remain as a historical record of what happened for those 10 or 12 or more webinars. They were captured as the live dialogues on YouTube. They were captured under 10 policy briefs, and they were captured in a summary monograph. And I will put the link to the summary monograph, which captures the links to the YouTube discussions and the policy briefs in the monograph. I think a fair conclusion on the pre-election audit throughout and on every aspect was that the country was failing to meet best regional and continental best practices. And we paid particular attention to regional and continental best practices, those of SADC and of the African Union. So now we're 3 weeks from the poll, and it's time to wrap up, and that's to include the pre-election audit and what has been transpiring during the past 2 months of active campaigning. Now, whilst every election since 2000 have been fierce contests, if I can put it that way, and are all disputed, this election seems more difficult and more complex than any before. Currently, we have 133 challenges before the poll has even taken place. These challenges are usually very, very few, and most of them take place after the poll. We have also the emergence of a challenge from within ZANU-PF, and therefore not just merely the inevitable clash between the two major political parties. And there's been huge speculation about what this means and what effect it will have on the poll if we have 3 strong candidates for the presidency. And I hope we will have some discussion on that. We've also seen in the weeks and months that have gone past, we've seen massive clientelism and the emergence of a huge lobby mechanism for ZANU-PF, in addition to the political party itself and the hustings and the mobilizing that take place. And in the press and in the media, we have seen there have been many, many questions about the role of FAS. We also have the regional and continental concern over the economy and the stability of the country. We have has been launched has been a debt relief strategy aimed at dealing with Zimbabwe's economic, governance, and land problems. And you've also had the frank admission that Zimbabwe presents a problem for the region. That comment was made by the main facilitator, Joaquim Chissano, 6 or 7 weeks ago. And the election also takes place in a massively changed international situation following the problems in the Ukraine, and what seems to be now the re-emergence of serious hegemonic conflict that we haven't seen since about 1990. So it's obviously crucial this election must allow Zimbabwe to overcome its international isolation. And the big question, as in the title, is whether this election will meet the regional and continental standards of best practice. So why the focus on standards? Well, elections have become one of the main bases for accepting state legitimacy. And it's been a fundamental issue in much of the interaction in development aid about the necessity for legitimate elections. But as many commentators have pointed out over the years, elections themselves rarely provide the total basis for accepting legitimacy. And here we have to point out, and it's an issue of big debate in Zimbabwe, the issue between legal elections, elections that meet all the supposed standards. In other words, there is an electoral commission, there is a voters' roll, delimitation takes place, voting happens, voting is counted, and a result happens. And legitimate elections, and those legitimate elections are those that meet best standards reflecting a fair contest. And too often, narrow legality is shown to have and result in a flawed outcome. So there are standards for elections, even though they're frequently ignored because of hard political realities. And too often, you end up with a minimalist judgment. And we've had several of them in Zimbabwe. There was an election, lots of people voted, and somebody won, and this must reflect the will of the people. But the minimalist judgment must deal with the facts and the extent to which the election meets best practice. Now, that's argued again and again what best practice is against these standards, regional and continental. And so, for example, in the aftermath of 2018, one of the election observer groups speaking on the webinar pointed out that after the 2018 election observers, all of them, made over 100 separate recommendations for improving elections in Zimbabwe. Now, that's a very large number of recommendations. And so part of what we're looking at this evening is the question about how many of those recommendations have been taken seriously and are reflected in the practices that we can see in the election through the pre-election audit and the current campaign. And so will the judgment then on this election measure itself against these criteria for improvement? In other words, when you make recommendations, you wish to see to what extent those things have actually taken place and the extent to which this election actually has met the recommendations that were made. Importantly, and Zimbabwe lives in a regional and continental community, will the judgment be made in a credible fashion against the best practice standards of SADC and the AU? These standards exist. These standards are there for judging the best practice of any election, and will the judgment of these elections be against the strict criteria of those judgments? And of course, the big question, the elephant in the room, what should be done if the elections fail the test of best practice? So these are the questions, amongst others, that we're considering tonight. And we have a very expert panel to discuss this. We have Justice Mabenzenge, who's a researcher in the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at the University of Cape Town, an eminent jurist and constitutional lawyer. Musa Kika, another eminent constitutional lawyer, the former director of the Zimbabwe Human Rights Forum, and Ringisai Chiko-Homero, who is a research consultant with the Institute for Security Studies and a well-established commentator on Zimbabwe. So the process this evening is that the two first speakers, Justice and Musa, have recently written a very, very detailed, complex analysis of elections in Zimbabwe. What does happen and what should happen, and they will present separately. Justice will be first, followed by Musa, and then Ringisai will comment, make his own observations on the election, and then go around them. Hello?
Because I think he sent it like around 2.
No, somebody was speaking there. Sorry. Okay. David, are we all good?
Yes, Tony.
Okay. All right. So, Justice, may I invite you to take the floor and make your presentation, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much, colleagues, for the opportunity to engage with you this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are joining us from. Before I start, I would like to just point that there is a possibility that I may be temporarily kicked out. In other words, I may temporarily go offline for a minute or so around 6 o'clock because I'm scheduled to lose power. So in that 1 minute, I will be connecting to the backup. So be rest assured that I would be back. I think Tony has done a very good job in terms of, painting or providing background to this conversation. And in that process, you've liberated me from saying anything about the background. And so I am free to just jump straight into my presentation. I think there are 2 critical questions that I would like to address in the context of the discussion that we are having today. The first is, what do elections that are credible look like? I think that's a fairly easy question. And the second is, what are the essential, when everything is said and done, what are the essential challenges that we need to deal with in the Zimbabwean context? And in my discussions with my brother, Dr. Musa Kika, he has graciously accepted to give the first attempt at suggesting some solutions. But as Tony also mentioned, the paper that we did together with Musa does detail some of the recommendations on what needs to be done. But I'm happy to also come back later and share even more thoughts around what the way forward should look like. There are 3 key instruments that we need to keep at the back of our minds whenever we talk about what elections that are credible should look like. In the context of Zimbabwe, we are guided by the Constitution, particularly the provisions around political rights, the right to free and fair elections, the provisions that regulate the way in which the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is supposed to operate. We are guided by the SADC principles and guidelines on the conduct of democratic elections. I once had a very intense conversation with one Zimbabwean judge who was of the opinion that the SADC principles and guidelines are just guidelines, they are not law. And then my view was no, there are certain parts of of that document that are principles which are applicable and binding. And then there are certain parts of that document that are guidelines in the sense that they give discretion to governments on how they can put in place certain arrangements to ensure that the elections are free, fair, and credible. The last instrument is the African Union Charter on Democracy, Good Governance, and Elections. I think those three provide a roadmap in terms of guiding us as a country towards achieving what would look like a credible elections. And obviously, there could be observers in the room tonight. I think those are the documents that you should be going back to and see if what is happening, what is obtaining in the country on the ground is consistent with the provisions of those three instruments that I have talked about. Of course, this is just law that I spoke about. Elections are not just about law. And I will address that particular point a little bit later in my presentation. Elections are much more than the law. They are also about political culture, but allow me to return to that. For now, I just want to say, if we also want to refresh our memories on what a credible election look like and the best practices in the region, I think we can sort of go back to what happened in Kenya in 2022. Can go back to what happened in Zambia 2021. Can go back to what happened in Malawi, particularly the rerun of 2020. Hear me very well, colleagues. I am not in any way saying those elections that I have cited did not have problems. In fact, there is no election that can be held under the sun which can be smooth or which cannot, which may not have any issue. Elections are massive logistical exercises, and therefore they are bound to be issues here and there. But in total, when you look at the way the election has been conducted, that election should have been conducted in a way that is sort of that is consistent with most of the basic and most important principles that are enshrined in the relevant instruments. And I think you are free to look at what happened in Malawi, Zambia, Kenya, to analyze or examine it in the context of the AU Charter on Democracy, Good Governance, and Elections, and the SADC principles. And their constitutional framework is very similar to ours. Now, what is that criteria for a free and fair election? To be free, elections must be held in an environment where everyone is free, where every candidate is free to campaign, and every member of the electorate is free to make political choices without any fear of reprisals for those choices. I think this is it. Sometimes I think we overcomplicate things. The question is, are the voters free to make the political choices that they want to make freely without any fear of reprisal? The challenge is that sometimes observers and other people look at whether there was violence or not. I wrote a paper and I shared those papers in the chat box, so you can actually download them and engage with them later. And I argued that I do not think it's appropriate to examine whether there was violence or not, or whether there was intimidation or not. I think the ultimate question is, were people free to make their choices without any fear of reprisal? And I will show you in a minute why that is important when I talk about the challenges in our country. Then the other element is that the media must be free to report on electoral processes without any fear of reprisals. Again, they must have access to all geographical locations around the country. And the institutions that are responsible for implementing elections should be transparent and should embrace the media. To be fair, elections must meet a number of standards, but these ones are what, in terms of our relevant legal framework, are key. One, the election must be held in accordance with established rules and regulations. So you can't make rules and regulations as you go. So for example, you can't say, in order for you to be an ordinary resident, to be considered an ordinary resident in a country, you must have been living in the country for the past, you must not have left the country and I'll be outside of the country for more than 18 months or something like that. You can't make those rules as you go. The rules must be in place, must be well established, must be known, and then you conduct processes in accordance with those rules. You don't make rules as you go. The second is candidates must have equal access to the public, or what we call in Zimbabwe state-owned media. The Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation should be giving candidates equal, particularly the presidential candidates, equal access to broadcast their campaign messages and so forth. The rules themselves must be fair, particularly treating every candidate equally and treating every voter equally. So it is not enough to just have rules in place. The quality of the rules matter. They must, of essence, be treating every candidate equally and every voter equally. Then these rules must be enforced impartially through independent bodies. Now, when we are talking about impartially, we simply mean that, number one, the manner in which disputes about these rules are decided and determined by tribunals, be it the Electoral Commission, be it the courts of law, the adjudication must be clearly without fear or favor, substantively speaking. But secondly, there must be an appearance of fairness and impartiality. So matters must not be dealt with in a way that diminishes public confidence in the independence and impartiality of those bodies that have been established to deal with disputes. Then lastly, electoral processes must be conducted by an independent body, and more importantly, in a transparent manner, right? But like I said, law on its own cannot guarantee a free and a fair election. There are other things that are important. One of those is strong institutions. For example, you must have an independent electoral commission that is able to conduct the processes impartially, objectively, and efficiently. I think Tony has indicated that we are just a few weeks away from elections. So you need a body that is able to work things out efficiently, but in a way that is impartial, without being dictated to by anyone, except the courts of law. Again, on strong institutions, there must be independent courts that are willing and capable of enforcing the electoral rules impartially, but also with speed. So it's not just about being impartial, but it's also about disposing these matters with speed. The whole purpose of setting up electoral courts is to ensure that disputes are dealt with speed. Because justice delayed is as good as or as bad as justice denied. Then the other element, apart from strong institutions, is political culture. Political culture matters. There must be a culture of democracy and respect for the rule of law, especially amongst the key actors. What I've done, colleagues, is to try, and I hope I've succeeded, to offer some kind of a framework that we can use to then judge this evening whether we are heading towards an election that meets the regional standards or not. Let me end by saying, what is the challenge? There are a couple of them, but I will restrict myself to a few. One, whilst I think on political culture, whilst Zimbabwe yearns for democracy, in my view, there is no culture of democracy and respect for the rule of law, especially amongst the key protagonists in this election. Whilst for many of us, elections are a mechanism for allowing people to decide freely who should govern them. And indeed, that is what the legal framework says. But for ZANU-PF and CCC, I think they have different perspectives on what elections are supposed to achieve. Of course, when you mention ZANU-PF and CCC in one line, you are then sometimes accused of equalizing what is not equal. And let me clarify, the two are not equal. But you will see in a moment why I've mentioned both of them in one line, and I've said they have a different perspective on what elections are supposed to achieve. For the governing parties, ZANU-PF, elections are a mere ritual to legitimate its continued hold on to power, regardless of the will of the people. You just need to listen to the speeches by the president, the speeches by the provincial leaders at campaign rallies. You will see that it's very apparent that ZANU-PF does not approach elections as a process through which citizens should decide who must govern them, but as a ritual through which the people must reward the party ZANU-PF for the role it played in liberating the country from the shackles of British colonialism. The opposition CCC's attitude towards elections is equally opportunistic. The approach appears to be ad hoc. It is based on building strong individual support bases as opposed to building a strong movement and forging cross-generational and cross-sectional alliances. The approach is also characterized by intolerance of divergent views. You just need to see the way people engage on Twitter, which is now X, or on Facebook. It is also characterized by something that they call strategic ambiguity. There's no need for me to go into detail about that. I'm sure you know, you have heard about that a lot. Of course, the failure by CCC to build a strong opposition movement is due to shrinking civic space as a result of ZANU-PF's authoritarianism. And I think we have an account of what has happened in the past couple of years. But it will be an injustice and a misdiagnosis if we just tell ourselves that CCC is in a state that it is because of ZANU-PF. Part of CCC's problem is poor leadership and lack of genuine commitment towards democracy. This is why I said there is a commitment towards building individual support bases as opposed to a strong opposition movement. Now, when you do not, you see, the reason why elections played out the way they played out in the countries that I mentioned earlier is because you had a strong opposition, not necessarily strong individuals, strong opposition. I do not think that Zimbabwe has that kind of an opposition at the moment. Now to wrap up, what are the three key issues which must be addressed? Three, and I will just list them. I won't explain. One is fear. We need to deal with fear. I wrote an article, which again I posted in the chat box, titled "Episodes of Violence and Prospects for Democratic and Free Elections in Zimbabwe." I wrote this article in 2019. I had this election in mind, but it was in 2019. If you read that article, it's very short. It's an op-ed, actually. It will tell you why I think fear. And there have been, scientific research that has been done to establish and measure fear. So I encourage observers, if they are in this room, to read that article so that you understand why earlier on I said, do not ask the question whether there was violence or not. Because there may as well not be any violence on the face of it. There might not even be intimidation in some locations. But the violence that happened in the past, the intimidation that happened in the past, which created a traumatic experience for the population, is unresolved. and is still guiding and restraining people from making free political choices. The second issue is that of restricted civic space. You know, there is a bill that is before the president to restrict the manner in which civil society organizations work. The fact that it has not yet become law does not change anything. The fact that it is a bill already has a chilling effect on the way people organize. And that's perhaps why you find that some of the organizations have become very reluctant to participate in this kind of discussions. Then lastly is disenfranchisement. I know that when we talk about disenfranchisement, what comes onto our minds immediately is the diaspora. And I know some people are talking about the latest judgment against Kasukuwere, but for me, that is not the problematic judgment. I think that judgment, in any case, I have a different view about that judgment, but I think the judgment that matters for me most is the Gabriel Shumba versus Minister of Justice judgment of 2018 or 2017. That judgment is terrible. I've done a critique of it. It disenfranchises the diaspora, yes. But we often forget that there is another critical mass of people who are disenfranchised under the rules that are applicable in Zimbabwe, or rather the absence of rules, is the visually impaired persons. Those, you see, the Constitution of Zimbabwe says everyone has a right to vote by secret ballot. The Constitution doesn't say everyone has a right to vote full stop. No, it says everyone has a right to vote by secret ballot. So under the current legislative arrangement, visually impaired persons are assigned by the head of the polling station. They assign someone, or they are allowed to bring anyone to the polling station to help them to cast the ballot. But that does not fulfill their right to vote by secret ballot. What must happen? And the last time I went to court, I was arguing, representing a group of voters who were in this situation, and we didn't succeed. What the other countries do is that they give visually impaired persons the choice to either say, I would like to be assisted to vote, or I would like to vote by secret ballot on my own, in which case a braille printed ballot paper must be provided as an option. So I will end there for now, Tony, and allow Musa to take it from here and even also proffer some of our proposed solutions. But I'm happy to come back later, answer questions, and even expand on what I think the way forward should look like. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you, Justice. Thank you for covering all that stuff. There's a lot in there. I don't have any particular questions at the moment. I think in the interest of time, the fact that you and Dr. Kika have building on a joint paper, I'd like right at this moment to move to Musa and give you the floor. Musa, would you like to come in?
Absolutely, Tony. Thank you so much, and I hope I'm audible. And
yes, you're audible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And Tony, thank you for bringing me together with my brothers Mavedzenge and Ringisai. So Justice has done a fantastic job of giving us a background and of what a good election should look like. And he also went on to proffer some critique around the current state of affairs. What I want to do is to just try and dive into some thoughts around what we need to start thinking about, what we need to start looking at, not necessarily looking at 2023 elections, but electoral contestation in Zimbabwe in general, more so looking at how we can resolve our perennial problem of contested elections going forward. For me, the starting point is that right now in Zimbabwe, people are tired of elections that do not work, elections that don't deliver on the will of the people. A few years back in 2019, we had churches coming together and issuing what they call the Sabbath Call, proposing a sabbatical on elections for some time, for us to dialogue as a people. Others have called for election boycotts. They are still calling for election boycotts. Others have simply decided not to participate. That's the state of affairs. And for us, the critical questions are, how do we ensure that elections are insulated, protected from manipulation? And secondly, how do we make election outcomes reflective of the will of the people? At the end of the day, you want the people to have confidence that their participation counts for something. Unless we answer these two questions, these 5-year electoral cycles will continue to be rituals, which pass for what others have termed performing democracy, others have termed it abusive constitutionalism, where elections become a smokescreen. Elections are used to legitimate hold to power, to legitimate illiberal regimes, which is what we are seeing happening in this country. So the focus is not for me to look at the problems. I think that has been done enough, but to look at some solutions. The big picture, consequences of bad elections, as a matter of history and psychology, we know that people tend to come out and participate where there is meaningful hope and prospect that their participation will count for something, that change is possible through polls. In Zimbabwe, electoral contestation has yielded the same results, same outcomes since 1980. And the danger with increasingly, increasing elections, conducting elections that don't deliver, is that people will start thinking of alternatives. And what are those alternatives? It's coups, it's popular action, revolution. And those alternatives are ugly. We don't want to get there. But the more we continue to have elections that don't deliver, the likely these are to occur. Why do we keep talking about elections? Why do we keep looking for solutions? Why should we keep participating? Because we must get things right, and we must keep trying until we get things right. As I said, the alternatives are ugly. They are not attractive. But we must keep talking and participating because we also do not want to fall in the trap of autocrats. Autocrats want us to believe that elections do not work. They want us to lose faith in elections. They want us to abstain from participation. So in actual fact, the narrative of rigged elections and elections that don't work in many ways actually work for the autocrats, those who don't want elections to work, those who have nefarious agendas. And it's important to maintain hope that the situation can be salvaged. And even though we have a situation in Zimbabwe at the moment that does not conduce to free, fair, and credible elections, what we must ask ourselves is, what can be done to ensure that our elections can at least substantially reflect the will of the people, even in an environment where all the protective mechanisms of a free, fair, and credible elections are manipulated and skewed towards the incumbent? This is a question that we think should detain us a little more than it currently does. In trying to think of solutions, there are a number of principles which we believe we should keep in mind. I'll mention about 3 or 4 of them. Number one, the fact that elections are a multi-causal phenomenon, right? The problems with elections are multifaceted, that they cannot be resolved by a single solution, right? There are multiple challenges and they require multi-pronged approaches, right? Yes, we have legal reforms that are needed, that's great, but we have a bigger question of political culture, right? So we need a series of interventions which operate at different levels, operating at different times, sometimes simultaneously, to try and address the problem that we have. So that's number one, elections being a multi-causal phenomenon. Number two, a culture of aversion to genuine and fair electoral contestation. In the grander scheme of things, culture trumps whatever legal and administrative systems and procedures that we have. It's possible that we may have the best administrative and legal systems for managing elections, but at the end of the day, if we do not have the right kind of culture, political culture, electoral culture, those legal and administrative systems can be tainted. They can be reduced to naught. So having legal reforms, administrative reforms is important, but it's only a step, right? The bigger prize is to think of how we can shift our political culture of intolerance, violence, fear, rigging, and aversion to genuine political contestation. These are things that we need to think about. The law alone, as we are aware, is not self-executing, right? The law relies on people who enforce that law, who interpret that law. It relies on personalities, on attitudes, on dispositions and predispositions of those personalities. But also, the law and administrative processes depend on the courts, right? Which are the last line of defense, which must pronounce on whether processes have been followed or not. But if you don't have courts that are exactly independent, if you have courts that have chosen a side, if you have courts that are manipulated, then even strong legal and administrative procedures on their own are not enough. The third principle to think about is elections being a multi-stakeholder affair, right? Because they are multifaceted in nature, they also are influenced by a multiplicity of stakeholders: state actors, non-state actors, public actors, private actors, domestic actors, regional and international actors. They all have a role. So while we may have conditions which may be making an organic case for reform in Zimbabwe at the moment, electoral reform, the circumstances alone are not self-activating, right? There is need for agency and organizing, to be done. So all these actors involved must be activated. With that background, let me now move to some actual recommendations. The first, we agree that legal reforms and administrative reforms are necessary. What are these? I think these have been discussed time without end. We need to look at the Electoral Act and ensure greater independence of ZEC. We need to relook at the composition of the Secretariat of ZEC, especially issues of military interference or linkages with the military in the Secretariat has been a concern for a long time. We need to look at universal suffrage, participation of everyone. We need to look at independence of the media. We need to end the statutory monopoly of ZEC on the control of voter education. We need to address the partisan nature of the state. We need to address mechanisms for the transfer of power after elections. We need to look at the Political Parties Finance Act and restructure the nature of political party funding and accountability mechanisms. We need to regulate the use of money in elections. If you look at our current election, you may actually characterize it as a money election. Money is moving. Money is working. Money is going to determine a lot of things. And we don't have any meaningful regulations in Zimbabwe that control expenditure in political campaigning. So we need to look at that. And as we do, we look at all these reforms and many that I haven't mentioned, that I won't mention. We need to be guarding against cosmetic and regressive reforms. But these reforms are just one area. At the end of the day, we must not forget that ultimately defective elections in Zimbabwe are not a legal issue, they are a political issue. So the real solutions are to be found in political solutions. So this is for us to start thinking politically and not necessarily legally, thinking of how we can shift attitudes and practices from a political perspective. But before I go to issues of attitudes and cultures, let me take a slight detour still on the question of legal reforms at regional level this time. There's a lot of discussion at the African Union level around unconstitutional changes of government, right? But unconstitutional changes of government are being narrowly defined to mean military and related violent takeovers of constitutional governments. But what we are seeing across the continent, including Zimbabwe, is that there is a lot of maneuvers around elections with an effect of actually unconstitutionally changing government. So when a people vote, elect a government of their choice, and there is electoral theft, that is unconstitutional change of government. But that is not fitting in the definition of unconstitutional change of government at the moment at the AU. So we may need to ensure that conversations at that level are also reflecting on the challenges that we are facing here. Why is this important? When we have these AU missions and related missions observing elections here, we need to make sure that their election monitoring is a bit more robust and scientific, looking at these other dynamics, which may not be being considered at the moment in those AU discussions. But let me move to issues of reform of attitudes and practices. Although our conditions here in Zimbabwe differ, for instance, from those in Zambia and Malawi in their recent elections, what those elections have shown us is that it is actually possible to attain state power for the will of the people to find manifestation, even in a politically repressive system, right? Provided certain actions are taken, provided certain practices are shifted, are changed, and I want to speak to some of them broadly around issues of attitudes and culture. Number one, transparency. And in my view, in this current election, this is perhaps the most important area we need to focus on in the little time that we have. An immediate intervention. Transparency, which will help us to expose shortcomings and gaps in the system, and these gaps will make a case for an organic case for reform. Transparency, which will force some level of compliance with the current legal framework that we have. Transparency, which will also help us build a case, if needs be, to challenge irregular processes and questionable results, right? How is that ensured? Ensuring that we are watching the vote, we are observing, we are monitoring, we are doing parallel voter tabulation, ensuring that we have agents in political, in polling stations, ensuring that we are monitoring the transmission of results, etc., etc. Number two, narratives. Positive framing on the value of elections. The question there is a balancing act. How do we communicate the challenges our elections are facing? How do we communicate the electoral theft? But at the same time, encouraging people to participate. Because at the end of the day, we want to build confidence and faith in electoral participation as opposed to destroying it. So we must revisit the language of apathy and negativity around elections to avoid the law of unintended consequences where participation becomes unattractive. Number three, building belief in the possibility of change through elections. It's important for people to believe that change can be attained through elections, that their voices matter and can manifest in the outcome at the end of the day, right? This is important if we are to get people to participate. And I gave an example earlier of Zambia and Malawi being some immediate examples of where this belief has actually carried the day and changed things. Number four, addressing polarization and political culture. The issue of polarization is extremely important on the national question in Zimbabwe. Polarization is perhaps the main obstacle to a culture of, good faith dialogue discussion in Zimbabwe. We currently are experiencing a litany of litigation, unprecedented litigation, electoral litigation before our courts in Zimbabwe. Every day you wake up, every day you sleep, you hear there's a case that has been filed. Every single day. We have lost track of the cases. When you see that kind of litigation happening, everyone turning to the courts, it shows you that this is a polarized society. It shows you that there is no faith or hope in any other forms of dispute resolution. It shows you that people have failed to speak to each other and to find each other, and all they are doing now is turning to the courts to fight it out. That's symptomatic of the polarization that we have. How do we resolve this? It's going to be a long-term issue. A one-party dominated repressive political environment over decades in Zimbabwe has resulted in identity politics, politics of toxicity, this polarity, brutality, fear, etc., etc. And these are far deeper problems that we need to confront. And at the end of the day, short-term electoral interventions will not yield the kind of long-term shift that we want until we change issues of culture and practice, right? Polarity being one of them. So for instance, yes, it's important to push campaigns for people to register to vote, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, the sustainable solution is to raise political consciousness so that people know on their own that they need to participate, understand the importance of civic duty. And that's just an example. We can pick many other areas. We need to work around messaging, how we calibrate our elections.
2 minutes, please, Musa.
Thanks, Tony. I'm going to round up now. So that we move our elections beyond just being focused on power and identities, but issue-based politics, right? Issues that unite us as opposed to issues that divide us, issues of the political economy, issues of wealth creation, issues of service delivery, issues of local governance. These are issues that you find are not finding a lot of spotlighting in this election as in the previous elections, because our focus is on political power in and of itself and identities as opposed to issue-based politics. Finally, in the interest of time, I'm going to end by speaking of political parties. In Zimbabwe, political parties have been a big part of the problem. They must be a big part of the solution. Political parties, these are vehicles through which state power can be attained and exercised per our constitution. But what we find is that unless we have good political and democratic health in these political parties, we can't expect the same political parties to drive this nation towards democratization in the way we want it to happen. So you look at political parties and you see imposition of candidates, subversion of constitutions and processes internally, consensus, not being respected, consultation not being respected. You can't have those kind of practices and you expect that when those people are in office at the national level, they will respect institutions. So it's then important for us to try and focus a bit more on the health of our political parties, on the democracy within our political parties, in order to have that democracy reflected at the national level. I'm going to end there, Tony, in the interest of time, and I'll be happy to engage with questions later on. Thank you so much.
Sir, thank you very, very much. Like Justice, you've raised an enormous number of questions, and I certainly have lots of questions, and I think probably many people in the room have questions too. But I don't want to preempt our discussion, and so I'd like to invite Ringisai in now. I think there are points where we can ask for clarification, and I'll come back to all of you. But in the interests of time and in building this discussion, can I please pass over to you, Ringisai? Ringisai, please come in the room.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks to the colleagues that have just been discussing, leading the discussions up to now. And I'm really just going to pick up from where they left, pointing out mainly on the issue of the political culture that exists, the issue of the profile and character of the citizen as an important actor that most of the time is left out when we speak of the overall stakeholders and actors who are at play during elections or around electoral processes. So what is the character and what is the nature of the and profile of this citizen who is supposed to be active in the political space? And I also speak a bit to the issues surrounding regional guidelines and continental guidelines, but more so how the bodies that are supposed to be watchdogs of these guidelines are non-committal, so to speak, or have a different approach to working with state parties and the creativity around the state parties and what they call an approach which is more an accompaniment than prescriptive. I think we're at a time where there's a lot of fatigue around the Zimbabwean elections, and this is from the citizens, from the political players themselves and the rest of the region and perhaps even the international community. And there is a sense that the more things change, the more things remain the same. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we are moving into a phase of a lot of comparative analysis, where there's a sense that, well, perhaps Zimbabwe is being held to too high a bar than other countries. And we are now getting various understandings of, well, perhaps this is really not fair. Perhaps Zimbabwe
Rengisai, if you can unmute, you are muted.
Oh, apologies, colleagues. Okay. So I was speaking to the effect of comparative analysis, which seems to be gaining traction around Zimbabwean electoral processes, and the sense that the Zimbabwean electoral processes are being held to a higher standard than what is accustomed in other parts of Africa. And also what Justice mentioned earlier, I want to say, look, there are no perfect elections. All elections are fraught with different problems. There might be teething problems, but there are also sustained problems. And Zimbabwe is one case where you have problems that have been sustained over time. And part of my submission is this is embedded in the political culture that was created from independence, but other scholars like to argue that this finds its genesis in the liberation struggle itself. I remember there's one book that was edited by Dr. Mandaza and Sachi Konye and Dr. Sachi Konye some way back in the 90s, where Kempton Makamure argued that the culture of democracy was really not what was fought for. And the way in which the liberation struggle came to being had more to do with a narrative that was anti a certain establishment, rather than trying to say the alternative is a democratic process where people have the liberty to choose and express themselves. And this has been followed by a lot of violence that we have seen, and at times we underplay the impact of this violence on the citizenry over the years. One point that Justice mentioned, and one point that really should stick out, is that in the current space, ZANU-PF might not need to have an all-out violence against the citizenry. Rather, just a reminder of what they are capable of and what they can do is sufficient to cow the citizens into submission. At the same time, the profile of the citizen has become, when you look at the submissions that has been given in terms of the percentages of voters that are urban and the voters that are rural, the profile of the rural citizenry, especially around the land reform, around all the aspects that have to do with the government.
We're losing you, Ringisai. Hello? Ringisai, we've lost you. Hello? Okay. Ringisai? All right, we seem to have lost him. If he comes back shortly, I'll come back to him. But
Tony, have we lost you too?
sorry, I unmuted myself. Sorry, folks. Whilst Rigisai tries to get reconnected, I just wanted to raise a question here related to the political context in which these elections take place. And this relates very much to an article that Justice you wrote some while ago in relation to the coup. And it's left me very puzzled because as I understand it, the effect of the Chiwesi judgment and the dismissing by I think it was the Constitutional Court of that judgment about the interpretation of Section 212, basically the military have an independent right to intervene in civilian affairs if they see the country under threat of the Constitution, has in fact created a constitutional amendment in our law. And you wrote upon that, I think very eruditely. But what I was confused about was, it seemed to me the implication of that was that when the military did that, they created a state of emergency. And if they did, does that state of emergency still exist? Because I've seen no order by the executive or the government to overturn that state of emergency. So maybe I can just put that to you quickly, because I think it might be an important context for those thinking about this election, that potentially this election could be taking place under a military government. Justice, would you like to comment on that?
Thanks, Tony. Just quickly, yes, indeed. I also have not seen any instrument that revokes that state of emergency. But I would like to even go beyond just the law on that particular point and say, usually what happens is that it's a fact that Zimbabwe went through a coup in 2017 November. We may have different interpretations on what kind of a coup it is. Of course, the court, it is important for me to acknowledge that the court dismissed the view that it is a coup, and that is the judgment that Tony is talking about. But the fact remains that the government of that time was removed as a result of processes which were carried out by the military. And to me, that sounds like a coup. Now, once you have a coup, practice says, once you have a coup, you can never return to normal democratic constitutional governance until and unless you have a proper election. Zimbabwe had an election in 2018, others would argue. But I think the reality is that that election was again very much contested. Its credibility was questioned, particularly because of the level of intimidation that was carried out. And the fact that anyway, that election was done without any meaningful reforms, which Musa has detailed. So what it means is that we are still in a state where de facto, and in the minds of many people, we are under a military rule. And I think if you look at the way governance is conducted, there is a semblance and a veneer of civilian rule, but in reality, power lies in the military. And that sets a tone for how, or that shapes the environment in which this election is being conducted, in my view. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you very much. Risai, can you hear me?
You're muted for a minute.
Hi, Tony. I
Okay.
can hear you now.
Okay,
Sorry,
sorry
I
about the
didn't.
network.
No, it is some
Yeah.
unexpected drop in network. Okay, so I was trying to speak to the political culture and to the extent that it affects the citizens' ability to actually participate in the political space. And I concur with the speakers that what we need to look at is that the election is a process, and it's not the event that happens, and it's not even from the date of proclamation, but what has happened since the last election. And what we know is the ruling party has been in a campaigning mode immediately after the 2018 election. But what is worse, in my view, is that when we got to 2019 into 2020, there was a deliberate and calculated mechanisms that were put in place to close out the civic space. And not only in terms of political activities, but general spaces for people to engage, participate, and assemble. There was obviously the COVID-19 regulations that kicked in, that had to try and mitigate the effects of the pandemic. But the manner in which the Zimbabwean government decided to implement the COVID regulations had a lot to do with also trying to respond to the emerging or the rising frustrations and mobilizing and organizing that citizens were beginning to do. If we remember very well, just around 2019 into 2020, there were a lot of labor-related protests from junior doctors to teachers to nurses, and a lot of conversations around civil service incapacitation. There was also a lot of activities around mobilizing around the state of governance and the state of service delivery. But when the state of emergency was proclaimed, I remember the conversations that we had at that point in time. The state of emergency was proclaimed 2 weeks before Jacob Ngaruvume's planned shutdown. And in conversations with some people, it was revealed that the state of emergency was really an extra measure put in place to deal exclusively with the mobilizing that was being done by citizens. So we went through a period of more than 4 years where the citizens' ability to participate in civic activities was closed, and that space was shut out. And for me, this translates to this kind of space where we are in, where there's no excitement around the forthcoming elections, where there is no general mobilizing and activities, even by the citizens themselves, around political issues, around key economic issues. We didn't see any visible civic expression of frustration around the gold mafia. There were no any visible expressions of frustration from the citizens themselves around a lot of corruption and misgovernance and bad service delivery that we've seen in the last 4 years. And this, for me, is really what is defining the elections and the space that the mindset that the citizen is entering this election in. And this is a mode of resignation, a mode of defeat, and a mode of really surrendering. And it doesn't help that in the previous elections, the results that the citizens were hoping or were anticipating have not been delivered. Bearing in mind that the mark of a credibility of or integrity of an election is not necessarily the change of government, but as has been reiterated, is that the citizen has had a clear opportunity to exercise their rights and free will to choose the representation that they want. And this is what we have not seen. The effect of the culture of violence continues in a manner that is subtle, that is difficult to quantify if you're trying to go by the book in observations or in your reading of the context, in the sense that the perpetrators of violence in the rural communities, especially in the rural areas, have gone without any consequences coming to them. The issue of impunity is what sticks high in the minds of the voter who knows the neighbor who was at the forefront of perpetrating violence in their community. And the same neighbor who was at the forefront of perpetrating violence in their community in 2008 is again one party's polling agent. And this speaks again to the quality of the kind of polling agents that an opposition party should have. It's not just a question of who can volunteer and participate and be paid at the end of the day, but actually the credibility, the character, and the quality of the person who is able to actually stand their ground in the polling station, somewhere in Mzarabani, somewhere in Chingeshuru, in a tent that has no electricity, where they are using candles. There are no, there is network shadow, so they cannot even quickly transmit the results or even quickly communicate if they're in danger. But so the space in which the citizen actually finds themselves is one that is inimical to them freely participating in a democratic process. And this really has to do with the kind of work that civil society and social movements have to look at post the 2023 elections as we go forward to say, what do we need to do to create an environment that really ensures that the free will of the citizen is respected and is expressed at the polling station. The second thing that we need to look at is the quality of the journalistic fraternity that we have in the country. While we really have problems with the state media, which is the dominant media, even by percentages of coverage in areas that you can access the public media more than you can access the independent media. We also have a depth in terms of the kind of quality of journalistic presentations of the issues of the day. A number of issues, when you begin to have conversations with the citizen, beyond just saying ZANU-PF has failed to deliver, the nuances around socio-economic rights, in my view, have not been clearly articulated to the appreciation of the citizen. And one of the areas that for me has been left out in civic activities and civic participation is really how to communicate to the beneficiaries of the land reform program that they are being shortchanged. That in as much as it is every Zimbabwean's right, the first thing is it is every Zimbabwean's right to have access to land without having any relations to a political party. The second thing is, even if you've been given land, you are not beholden to a political party. The third thing is the tenure that defines your ownership of this land should be really explained and defined to your understanding so that you do not feel that your existence in this piece of land is precarious. And it is this citizen that has been left in the code. When you look at a lot of civil society and programming and social movement programming, which are really professionalized and bureaucratized, there's this space where the rural citizen, the citizen who has been placed in the resettlement area, has not the appreciation that they actually have more socioeconomic rights than what they are getting. And this space has been left out to only the dominant political party to play out. I'm not really discounting the issues that these places are difficult to access. These places, they have a lot of gatekeepers to get to them. But the conversations within the civil society movement and the social movement around how do we actually speak to the obtaining realities of more than 60% of the electorate, who is not really, who does not see the direct relationship between the exchange rate, who does not see the direct relationship between tax structures and corruption, but he has other daily concerns and daily struggles that they face with around land, around the being beholden around due to the financing structures and financing models that have been put in to support agricultural activities to smallholder farmers and subsistence farmers. And this citizen is not awakening to a point where they know that they have to hold the government accountable, that they can hold their councillor accountable. Their relationship with the state has always been they receive and they feel beholden to this state. And I think this is the structure of relationships that needs to be looked into very carefully by the social movements, by civil society beyond 2023. Because I believe we need to build a mass movement of citizens that can demand accountability in small spaces and gradually build up to the greater national question. And for me, this is the space where civil society and unfortunately the incestuous relationship that at times exists between the civil society and the opposition party makes it difficult to differentiate issue-based movements and civil society that is really pushing for political and governance reforms. The second thing that I want to speak to is the position of the country in respect to the SADC guidelines and the SADC as a regional body in itself. I think what we know is how the nature in which SADC is structured, its observer mission and its advisory council is one that is really inaccessible to the ordinary citizenry. We know that the SEAC was in country in the last 2 months, but we do not know what was their finding. Those findings have never been made public. And because this is a government, this is a relationship between SADC and government, so everything has to come through the ministry. But it's a space that we have not lobbied to say, can we rationalize and redefine these relations so that we have more spaces of putting pressure, we have more spaces of holding the government accountable, and we have more spaces of speaking to SADC directly. When you speak to the SADC as a regional body, their sense is we are not prescriptive.
2 minutes, please, bring it high.
Okay. The sense that they are not prescriptive, and they feel that their approach is evolutionary, not revolutionary in terms of governance, in terms of electoral democracy. But also there is no space for active citizen participation at the SADC level, where we can actually lobby for a different orientation and a different approach to how you guide, how you manage and measure credibility and integrity of elections in member states. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Ringasai. Thanks very much. Okay. So before I want to move on to the floor, I think there are 2 very general questions that I'd like each of you to address very, very quickly. In all of your presentations, without going into the detail, and we have been into the detail during the pre-election audit and right up until recently, in the narrow detail of what this webinar is about meeting best practices. And there seems to me then all the presentations is this implied criticism of the existing electoral process. So very quickly, I'd like you to address 2 questions, and I'll go to each of you and give you a very short space of time, and then I'll mute you, if that's okay. The first question is, to date, and we know that polls are sometimes very surprising, but nonetheless, to date, have we met best practice and in the framework of SADC and the AU? And the second question, which is related to that, should we not have conformed to best practice, what should be done? So I'd like to go to each of you in turn and just very briefly, the first question can be answered yes or no, and the second one might take a little unpacking for each of you. But very briefly, have we met best practice? And secondly, if we don't meet best practice on or after the 24th or 25th of August, what should be done? Can I go to you first of all, Justice?
Sure, Tony. Thank you. Quickly, the first question, my answer is no. We have not met the best practice. The second question that you've asked, what should we do if we don't? Look, I have never thought that we have an election on the 23rd of August. When I did my paper in 2019, I argued that what we are going to have is a ritual. So we are going to have a ritual on the 23rd of election, and people may call it election or whatever it is, but it's just a ritual. Its outcome is predetermined. Now, what should we do? I think what needs to be done is we need to remove ourselves from the box that we have put ourselves in. The first thing that we need to do is to understand that our problems are very much political and they will never be resolved through legal processes. So going to court is not going to resolve our issues. Our issues are going to be resolved through political dialogue. And I think it is the nature of the dialogue that we need to further discuss so that we don't end up in a dialogue that is elitist, that is not going to change the fundamental structure of our state and so forth. But my proposal is what we need to do as Zimbabweans is we need to engage each other, regardless of what we think of the other. That is the only way we are going to find a solution. Then lastly, it will be gradual. It's not going to be overnight. I think there is a philosopher who said, claim no easy victories, comrades. The problem is we sometimes want to claim very easy victories. Sometimes you get this court judgment that says something that you like, and then you say, yeah, change is coming. No, it's just a game. It's just a dance. We have to be very methodological in our planning. And we have to understand that one set of political changes will open up the space for the next level of the process. But what we need to start with is we need a dialogue framework. And then we need to agree on what are those things that need to be dialogued around. And what are the tactics for that dialogue? I will leave it there for now, Tony.
Thank you, Justice. Short and sweet. Musa, over to you. 2 questions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the first question is definitely no, we have not met best practice. In fact, this election is likely the worst election we are going to have as a country in the last, I don't know, so many cycles. The election has already been discredited before actual polling. Second question, I completely agree with Justice. The solutions will always be political, as we raised in the presentations, not legal. And political solutions must be pursued. Dialogue is definitely an important one. The nature of the dialogue is one that we can debate and argue, national dialogue, political settlement, etc., both. But we need this. What is clear is that we cannot look to the outside world. We cannot look to the region. We cannot look to the international community. The answers are going to be within us, and we have to introspect. Observers, one point I will illustrate this issue about not looking to externals through electoral observers. Observers in Zimbabwe have always endorsed our elections, right? So they'll come again and observe these elections, stolen elections, and they'll pass them as substantially meeting the mark of being free and fair. And we move on. Yes, they have done in the past. But we know that election observers have been discredited, international observers, recently in Malawi, where they endorsed the TPEX elections until the courts in Malawi reversed that. The only observer mission report that we have seen in Zimbabwe which says our elections were not free and fair is the 2002 Kampempe report by Judge Sisi Kampempe and Dikgang Moseneke, which said the elections were not free and fair, but that report was hidden by President Thabo Mbeki for 12 years until the South African Constitutional Court said it must be released. Only then did we know what the report was saying. So we really can't look to the outside world. The solutions are going to be within us. The point to be made is that we can't give up. We can't throw our hands in the air. We have to keep engaging until we get things right. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Musa. Short and sweet. Ringasai, over to you. 2 questions.
So quickly, the first one is, hi, Tony. Can you hear me? Hello?
Please?
Yes, Tony, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah. So quickly, the response to the first question is no. We haven't. If anything, we've regressed in some aspects. The response to a second question is, I think that's a bit of a very complicated question. And so the first thing that I think is the situation that we are in can be resolved by some form of a political settlement of sorts. But behind that submission is what would push the current players and actors to the table? What are the hot buttons and what are the incentives that would actually push the current actors to that table? Because from what we have seen, when they feel like they're in a comfortable space and they feel secure politically and economically, there is no incentive to get on the table to discuss the hard issues, which is why, for me, it has to be a combination of various strategies. Social movements, civil society, political actors, and even the international community in one way or the other. This is something that really needs a lot of hands on the deck. And to an extent, the current ADESINA process, the high-level debt reform reform process, if it survives post the August 2023, is one space which is an opening. It's not the answer, but it's an opening for some conversations to be sustained and maintained, because the process, at least from ADESINA, is put the hard questions on the table, and they have to be tackled. And for me, it's the beginning of the, nudging and chipping away on this big, colossal issue of governance and political progress in the country. So for me, we have to look at every available opportunity to push. And we need more strategic thinking rather than small tactics that are joined together to achieve small wins that are not really speaking to a long-term goal and a point of success that we need to reach.
Thank you very much, Ringisai. Okay, folks, we have some time left now for people to jump in. I posted in the chat, if you wish to participate right now, if you go down to reactions and you put your hand up, I'd be happy to answer your questions or give you comment. So please put your comments either in the chat or raise your hand, and happy to bring you in. And I may take the opportunity to pull some people in from the floor. So far, the process to date gets a resounding no. And I think that's a little surprise from the 10 or more webinars that we've had previously, because as I pointed out in the beginning, the general consensus is that we were not meeting best practice. Anybody wish to comment? Annalena, please come in. And,
thank you, Tony. Oh, should I put on the video as well?
No, video would be nice.
Okay. Wait a minute. All right. This is a very interesting discourse, but I was particularly interested in Ringisai. Is it Ringisai? Or is it? Yeah. Anyway, the comment. I don't know. Was it from Musa Kika or Ringisai? I can't remember. But pointing out on the role of the citizen, because the citizen is basically a forgotten issue. We discuss political parties dominated by the elite. We discuss the state government, the dominant government. But I'm always worried that nationals of one SADC country consistently look at their own problems as if they are absolutely unique. When in fact, when you look across the continent, you are seeing very similar patterns with a few changes here and there, but exactly the same. Dominant political parties, particularly whether or not they've gone through liberation struggle. Hey, here is Botswana, which for many years was regarded what? As the model. We haven't had a change of government from the day we gained independence. And so, and the ruling party cannot claim that it has a liberation struggle that it should be rewarded for. But as a young academic in my 20s, I was sobered by a chilling fact that those of us who discuss and debate, particularly in English, are such a tiny, tiny little minority in our countries and across the African state in general. Very, very few countries in the SADC region or in Africa actually have more than 10% people who have actually gone anywhere near tertiary education, let alone finished it. Or secondary school, we are still very far behind. We are looking at the majority of citizens who haven't had equal access to those of us who debate, who lead NGOs, civic space, who lead political parties. Our citizens do not have, the majority haven't arrived where we are. We are the ones who hog the best jobs, who hog the best business opportunities, and who lead organizations, NGO spaces where we basically make them our business to feed our children, our families. So political contestation has essentially been contestation among the elite of Africa. But the things that Rungisai said, that if we don't actually begin to discuss with the majority of our people, the very majority that I say, many of them have come nowhere near tertiary education. We have to find a language of discussing with our people so that they all learn to link the vote, the power that potentially is tied up with the vote, to the power to make a difference in the opportunities for life, the opportunities for jobs. They have seen people contesting become rich through political parties, through being ministers, through being members of parliament, through being local authority representatives. But that is still a tiny little drop in the ocean. So the issue now is not so much what the institutions that are dominated by the educated are going to do to monitor elections, but what we should be doing as citizens to empower the voters. It's not easy, but it has to be done. These are the people who must demand accountability from our political parties, from our politicians, and even from NGOs, and also from the corporate world. Until we find that language where every single year, the ordinary citizens are mobilized to demand accountability from us, we will be singing the same song about stolen elections. Yeah, they're stolen because it's only a minority that have the power to actually steal those elections, that have the power also to incarcerate the minority who challenge them. So the issue is, what must we do? Those of us who are privileged, what should we be doing to ensure that the ordinary citizen, who by all accounts, as we speak today, very limited secondary education, very limited tertiary education. At SADC,
Alina, please.
Yeah. Anyway, that is basically my issue, Tony, that until we start engaging with what to do with our fellow citizens who have not had the privileges and the challenges that come with those privileges, we are not going to change anything.
Thank you, Adelina. I think you made that very forcefully and built on the perspectives of others about how the citizens have been left out. I don't see any other hands there, so I'm going to take some liberties here. I'm going to ask Ringisai's colleague, Piers, whether he would like to make a few comments here. Piers?
Hi, Tony. I don't know whether you can hear me. I'm actually driving as I'm listening to you guys.
All right.
But no, let me just say a couple of things. I mean, the one thing I think is interesting is that we need to explore, however tepid or problematic we feel those routes are, we need to explore options that are available to get the detail of where there may be deficits around the framework, the guidelines or the African Charter framework, that you could get these conversations going, because it seems to me that the benefit that those that don't want this conversation have is that the silences on these issues obviously benefit them. So SADC, and I can hear a collective sigh in the room, in May, for example, conducted a pre-election assessment, and some civil society entities engaged with that assessment. No one, as far as I'm aware, within civil society has followed up to find out what actually happened. Presumably, SEAC gave Zimbabwe a green light that the conditions on the ground were acceptable for election. But what criteria did they use? What aspects of the guidelines, of the regional or continental standards, did they use? This is information that needs to be pursued. In the event of contested space after this election, one clear area for engagement is with the governance pillar of the debt arrears process that Ringisai has pointed out, which is going to use the elections as a key indicator for assessing progress with reform. There are civil society actors involved with that governance pillar, as there are with the other two pillars as well. Do anyone in this room know who those actors are? Is there room for civil society to push for more representation in those discussions, for there to be updates on what's being discussed and agreed in those discussions? So I do think there is space, but it's going to require a proactive engagement around these issues, which sadly we have not really seen to date, specifically in terms of the election space, I think. So I and there are a number of reasons and mitigating reasons for that, but I do think that those are two examples of areas where there needs to be more proactive engagement. Thanks very much, Tony.
Thank you, Piers. Teresa, please unmute and come in. Teresa? Hello? Teresa, you have your hand up. If you unmute.
Hello?
Hello, yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Please keep it short.
We can hear you now.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, I'll be very short. With me, I'm from Botswana, and the concerns that have been raised by the presenters so far, it's not like they are unique to Zimbabwe only. Like my colleague, Dr. Unalen Nasilolwane said, even in Botswana, we are experiencing similar problems. But the gist of the matter here is, as civil societies, when like SADC observer missions go out there, what instruments do they use that are not actually accessible to the ordinary man, ordinary citizen, even to us, some members of the NGO? We don't know what criterions they use to measure, and at the end of the day to say these elections were free and fair. The other issue that was raised by Ringisai was that we should dialogue. There should be this dialogue framework, and we should actually not run to the courts if we have problems. we must actually, as political parties should engage. Who do you engage here? Because you'll find that people who are the elite, who are in the ruling minority, they are the ones who have all the powers, who have all the information, who at the end of the day are the ones who can dictate what can be done and what not can be done. So the ordinary person becomes so frustrated. And the other thing is voter education. I mean, the ordinary citizens, they need to be civic societies. We are actually hampered because we don't have resources to reach out to the ordinary people in the rural areas, so as to teach them about the power of their vote and to know that they have a right and that their voice can be heard when they do the voting. You will find that during election time, somebody raised something like money will be, thrown around, and you'll be shocked, where do these guys get money from? Because the poor citizens, when after voting, you find that they are, sidelined by the party that goes into power. Mostly, like in our case in Botswana, we have been ruled by the same party since 1966, over 50 years. And it's like they have everything in the book. They are the ones who will determine what should be done and what should not be done. And political party funding, we have a problem here. You'll find that most women are not actually able to engage into politics because they don't have resources. And that hampers the voice of women in politics, in parliament, and definitely it stifles their voice and contribution to the development of the country. So for now, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I think you're making an extension of the points that were made by Arnolina, and that the problems in Zimbabwe are not unique, but common right across the region. Ringisai, you disappeared. You had your hand up. Anybody else want to come in? Yeah.
So, Tony, so for me, there is a lot of factors at play in the current space where Zimbabwe finds itself. And we cannot be oblivious to the fact that justice is raised about the not so cool, the military assisted transition, nor should we be oblivious to the fact of the space that the government of Zimbabwe finds itself where it feels comfortable in its position. But what we need to move towards is a situation where the relations are shifted, and this does not happen overnight, obviously, but where the relations between the state and the citizens are shifted, and the government begins to fear its people, not the people fearing the government. And we get to this process by a lot of low-level social, to use the Cuban word, social engineering, where you begin at a very small scale to discuss around accountability and governance issues around small things like the water point committee, around the local school. You begin to bring governance and accountability to the realities that the ordinary person faces. And you build their agency at that level. And when they have this agency, you then begin to have a rights-claiming citizen. And this is the only space that you can begin to have a mass-based movement towards a nation building or national conversations that engages the broad spectrum of the citizenry. We need to realize the spaces that we are moving into, where by virtue of the laws that have been put and that are going to be put, one of the seriously handicapped sectors is going to be the civil society. There are going to be a lot of legitimacy questions around the civil society, a lot of representational questions around the civil society that will actually handicap it in its ability to speak. But it also has to play a balancing act to say, where are we getting space from this government, no matter how small? where are we getting space to converse? Where are we getting space to have minimum levels of dialogue? Where are they giving us space? And how can we strategically maximize on this space and present ourselves not as antagonistic all the time, but as people who are trying to drive towards some solutions that are comprehensive and all-inclusive. And this is a balancing act that is tricky, because ZANU-PF has a lot of, has a huge history of swallowing up players that become closer to them. But it's something that where the civil society and social movements need to begin to reimagine their role going forward. And how do we really begin to bring pressure to bear that the government wants to sit on the table? That will be my submission in that regard.
Okay. Well, thank you, because you just preempted me. I was going to give you and Musa justice in the last few minutes. Any comments that you wanted to make, but I guess you've made them. So maybe I can move to Justice and then to Musa for any last comments and thoughts that you have on this evening. Justice, over to you.
Thanks, Tony. I think first, thank you very much, Tony and Ibo, for organizing this event. A very timely conversation to have. And thanks to my two colleagues who were on the panel for very incisive contributions. I can see that Ibo is here now. Maybe let me conclude by way of responding to one of the comments that have been made. In fact, two comments. The first is that the challenges that we face in Zimbabwe are not unique to what is in the region. I think to some extent I agree with that comment, but just to a limited extent, because I think whilst on the surface, the challenges that we are experiencing appear to be similar, in the sense that there's shrinking civic space, there is poverty, there's unemployment, there's inequality. But I think Zimbabwe has certain nuances that I think we need to be very much aware of. The level of, and those nuances, they are to do with the way Zimbabwe got its independence and transitioned into the post-independent state. I think it's quite competent to give that kind of history. But the point I'm trying to make is that the amount of power and the extent of state capture in Zimbabwe, particularly by the military and the paramilitary forces, is quite nuanced. And I don't think I see the same in South Africa. I don't think I see the same in Botswana. Although we are all struggling with the same socioeconomic challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. But I don't think in Botswana, in South Africa, we've had situations where the military has actually come out on TV and openly declared that the office of the president is a straitjacket, and meaning they will not salute any winner in an election who has not been supportive of the liberation struggle, or who has actually not been in the liberation struggle. We have also not had any situation in the region where results of an election have been withheld for more than a month, causing the entire regional bloc to actually convene a meeting to discuss what the way forward ought to be. So, of course, these events that I'm talking about happened more than 7 years ago, but we are still stuck there because we are a country that, in my view, has certain challenges that I think in terms of scope and degree are different. Although I would accept that on the surface, poverty, inequality, and unemployment are not problems that are particular to Zimbabwe. Then lastly, Tony, if you allow me, on the comment to do with, if you are going, somebody commented and said, how do you do dialogue in Zimbabwe? Because the elites know each other and they will simply come up with, know each other. And I think the other concern was, who exactly do you dialogue with? I think the reality is that, there are examples in the history. If we look back into history, there are examples, there are blueprints around how dialogue of this kind of nature have been done. South Africa presents us with the most recent example, a dialogue leading to its transition to freedom in 1994. It was not without its own challenges. It doesn't mean South Africa has no challenges at the moment, but the generational challenge of that time to conduct that dialogue in the manner that they did, I think they achieved it. Namibia, in the period towards 1990, offers also another example. Kenya, actually, in the post 2007 crisis, entered into a dialogue which I think left Kenya in a much better position than it was supposed to be. Yes, there are problems in Kenya today, but I think those problems in Kenya could be worse if it wasn't of the dialogue that happened, which was brokered by the late Kofi Annan and the elders. So my point is, it is possible to have dialogue, but what needs to happen is we need to first change the way we perceive each other as Zimbabweans, but also stop thinking that we are so special that everyone will stop whatever that they're doing, and then they will start paying attention to us. We are our own liberators. And what we need to do is we need to start talking to each other, but we need to carefully think through the issues that we need to dialogue on. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Justice. Musa, any last thoughts, comments?
Yes, thanks, Tony. I want to, Miles did post a question and a comment in the chat. I hope you saw that. One of the comments is really important to note. I will respond to the first part of the question, which is on why we continue to see a drop in women participation, even though women constitute the bigger component of our demographic group. I'll pose two responses in my view. Number one, the political spaces continue to be unwelcoming for women. Whether you speak of violence, whether you speak of hate speech, whether you speak of culture and attitudes, whether you speak about the cost of participation for women remains very high. The spaces are unhospitable, they are unwelcoming. The second one, I would think of the unintended consequences of the women's quota, the 60 seats that are reserved. Personally, I didn't support, just allocation of those seats. I think what would happen and what has actually been happening is that women have then been relegated to just those seats, to say, look, you can't contest for the contested seats because you have yours. Go and fight over your 60. So these are unintended consequences of, I think, attempts to try and make sure that we push women. If we are to legislate, I would push for a situation where we actually legislate 50-50, where political parties are required at nomination, to submit 50% women, 50% men. I think if we are to legislate, then we go that route. Otherwise, the current route has unintended consequences. And then my final thoughts, for me, I would say autocrats, those who subvert elections, they thrive on divisions, they thrive on misinformation, they thrive on abstinence from participation. This is where citizens come at the center. We cannot, it's wrong to leave everything to the opposition and think the opposition will replace the citizens in fighting the battles that the citizens are supposed to be fighting. Many times we then take pleasure in directing all criticism that we have to the opposition without looking at ourselves as citizens. But it's important for citizens to act, bearing in mind that the kind of democracy we have in Zimbabwe could be characterized as a fake democracy. We are really not a democracy in the true sense of the term. So we must not forget that as we are looking at what the opposition is doing to the exclusion of what us as citizens are doing. The question becomes, what are we as citizens doing? Thank you so much, Tony, for the platform.
Thank you very much, Musa. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Miles, note your comment. Unfortunately, our gender representatives had to withdraw at the last minute because they're all involved in elections and had to disappear to other places, and we were not able to replace them. Our general view is to keep gender front and center. Certainly from RAU's perspective, we put a lot of energy into trying to address the gender question in elections. Our general view is it's to do with the representation problem is to do with the first past the post and the gender issue and the gender quota. I think countries that move to proportional representation do much better on gender representation. But anyhow, we've come to the end of this. I think to summarize a very complex and detailed discussion is difficult. I think this particular webinar builds on, as I said before, a long, detailed analysis of the pre-election process. And we have not covered all of that and repeated it. It's all there. I posted the link to all of those webinars and policy briefs, and everybody is at liberty to go and look at the history of this particular process. We came here at the 11th hour before these elections to provide a final summary. I think in that final summary, two things have come out very strongly. One is a re-endorsement of the position that on all objective criteria, Zimbabwe looked very unlikely to meet the criteria of best practice in SADC, in the AU, and international. I think our three speakers made that point, and it just builds on the detail that's been provided before. On the way forward, I think that's been a much more complex question. And it's in two parts, really. One is that the clear need for dialogue and a broad-based dialogue, and a dialogue that must address the immediate problems as well as the long-term problems and the complete marginalization of the citizen. That elections do not reflect very often the will of the people, and neither the deep participation. Many years ago, the Afrobarometer, Michael Bratton and others posted a very important report on the citizen of Africa, and they pointed out voters, but not yet citizens. And I think that comment has come through all our speakers, that what we have is voters and not citizens. But what I think they've also pointed out is that there are also attempts in many countries, in Zimbabwe, as we're discussing today, to actually marginalize the citizen, to take away the power of the citizen to participate. And that was very clear in many of the webinars we had dealing with the 5 themes, and that is that ability of the citizen to participate, to interrogate their candidates, to go to meetings wherever they are, to receive the information that they need. That's missing. And that's the longer term problem, and that links to the deeper problem that we face and many other countries faces, is that we do not have a political culture that's based firstly on mutual toleration, and as Iba has pointed out repeatedly in these webinars, to contests in which people are opponents and not enemies. The party that opposes you is not an enemy, it's an opponent. And you treat them as an opponent because reality is that the regimes may change. And what may happen is that today you're in power and tomorrow you're not. Therefore, mutual toleration rather than war is the way forward in this political culture. The second thing, I think, is the way in which the game is played, and that is the abrogation of the right to use the legal and administrative powers at the hands of the state and of the government to handicap and trip up the opposition. These are the fundamental deep structure problems that we need to face in Zimbabwe. So thank you. We've got 3 weeks to go and we'll see what happens. It's obviously a highly complex election. We're going to hear what happens over the coming weeks. Ibo was able to drop in very briefly. We didn't have to drop again. And he said, please convey his thanks to the 3 presenters, to Justice, to Musa, and to Ringisai. Thank you very much for giving up your time. And thank you for putting all the hard work that you did in to make this a very erudite, detailed, and highly complex discussion this evening. And to all of those who were